class number 4, the Bible's genres.
How you spell that?
Genre. It's almost your name, just add another letter in there. All right, so before we dive in, who wants to take a shot at trying to define genre? What is genre?
Well, it's a
Category.
type of writing. It could be fiction, mystery, poetry.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
yeah,
great.
okay.
Perfect. Yeah, it's what type of literature is it? So genre for this class, genre is a way of classifying something according to its type or its style rather than the specific content or storyline, right? So we're talking about type and style of writing. So biblical genres are normally identified by a book's style, a book's structure, the form, the tone, the content, the different literary techniques that the author uses. And so in the verse on your handout there at the top, we got Luke chapter 24, verse 44. It says, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." And what's interesting is that in that one verse, Jesus points out himself 3 different genres. He points out poetry, which is the Psalms. He points out prophecy, and he points out historical narrative when he's referring to the law of Moses. So in one verse, Jesus identifies 3 types of genre. Now, what are some problems that you think that we might run into if we don't consider genre when we read our Bibles? What are some problems that you think we might face?
Well, in the Psalms, some of them follow, I don't know if acrostic is the right word,
Okay.
but each stanza begins with one letter of the alphabet. So sometimes that's kind of forced to make that happen. Or if you wanted it to rhyme, like some poetry does.
Right, yeah. And if you don't even consider that it's poetry, well then,
Yeah, right.
right? Are there any other problems you think we might run into if we don't consider the genre? I think just overall, just probably misinterpreting it, missing it, maybe making too much of something that's not meant to be there, and so on. There's a lot of problems we can run into. Understanding genres is important because they impact the way that we study Scripture. Before we ever get to the actual text of a biblical passage, we need to understand what type of literary genre is being used so that we can then properly, right, going back to where we started, so that we can properly observe, interpret, and apply the text. Right? We need to know what kind of genre it is. So today, this lesson, we're flying at a high altitude when we look at genre, right? So high altitude means we're not going to dive in and look at every single thing in depth. This is meant, again, just to be broad and to kind of give you the categories to think through, and then you can process it more later. All right, so the first question is, what are biblical genres? What are the biblical genres? Well, the genres we find in the Bible are typical of genres found in other literature. So it's not like the Bible has brand new genres that aren't common in other literature. For example, apocalyptic literature, like in the book of Revelation. Right? That may seem strange to us now, today. It does to me sometimes, probably does to you as well. It was normal in biblical times when it was written. On the front of your handout is a chart that you can see there, a handy little chart that breaks down the genres of the Bible's books. So you guys can take a look at that. It categorizes all the books of the Bible into the genre that it's in. That's a great little tool that you have there. And don't limit it, because some of the books of the Bible can contain more than one type of genre within itself. But overall, these are the types of genres that we have, and these are the books that fit into those genres. All right, now it's important to note that the biblical authors themselves understood that their writings fell into certain genres. So like they knew that they were writing poetry, or they knew they were writing historical narrative and so on. They knew that. It wasn't like they were blinded to it. They knew what they were writing. And oftentimes what they did is they wrote in such a way that it reflected the kind of literature that was available to them in that time as well. So for instance, the Ten Commandments, the way that that's written and laid out, that was very similar. It reflected the structure of treaties that were used with Near Eastern kings in that time period. All right, so these would have been common literary genres to the people that read them. Now, even though this chart shows us that we have many different types of genres, it's important to remember that we have many genres, yet one storyline. Even though there's a diversity of genres, there's a single unified storyline in the Bible. They are not meant to compete with one another, even though there's different styles at play here. So let's look at these genres. We're going to go through these, each one that's listed there in the chart for us. And the first one we're going to look at is narratives. Narratives or histories. A substantial part of the Bible is history. A massive part of the Bible is history, it's narrative. Why is that? It's because the Christian faith is about historical facts. The things that we read about in the Bible actually happened in a real time and space with real living people. And so the Bible is telling us fact. It's telling us that Jesus was a real man who really lived and died and rose again in our place as we're coming up on Easter. In fact, we're going to look at this Sunday on 1 Corinthians 15 that if the Bible's not real, if Jesus wasn't a real man who died and rose again, then we're kind of wasting our time here, right? So the Bible contains an enormous amount of history because it's about real things. It's about facts. It's truth. Well, also the Bible is a historical record of how God has dealt with his people. And so we look at the Bible, and the historical record revolves around three major events in history. These are on your handouts for you. We have first the Exodus from Egypt. We have the exile in Babylon, and the inauguration of the church through the death and resurrection of Jesus. Those are the three major events and how God has related to his people, how he has worked on their behalf, how he's been carrying out his redemptive plan. And all of those things that are written about really happened. Now, beyond just telling us what happened, though, he tells us why. The historical narrative also tells us why things happened. We read them and we profit from them. It's actually for our good to read history, to read the narrative, especially in the Old Testament. Biblical histories and narratives, they're rich sources that display God's faithfulness to his people for all time. We can look back at them and we can glean just in seeing how God has always been faithful to his people, to his plan. He's good. He's been faithful to his word. He's kept his promises and so on. So we look back at all these things and we reflect on the character of God. Now, one temptation, though, is we want to read historical narrative a lot of times, and we think that it's to mimic the characters in the stories, right? But if we're honest, most of the time, we probably don't want to mimic some of the characters in the Bible, right? Like, it doesn't paint people in this glorious light that everyone in the Old Testament were great examples to follow after. In fact, the opposite is true most of the time. They all fell. They all messed up horribly at times. So it's not about us trying to mimic characters in the Old Testament, although we can learn from examples at times. It's about the character of God and how he has been saving and judging his people for all time. All right, so that's historical narrative. Next, we're going to look at wisdom and poetic writings. This is point number 3. We have wisdom and poetry. We're going to look at these two things together, wisdom and poetry, for a reason. We have the poetic books in the Bible are Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And they have elements of poetic structure to them, right? They contain wisdom literature within them. So they're very poetic, but they contain wisdom for us to live by. They're a mix of both of these things. So we have wisdom and poetry. But now let's define real quick wisdom literature. What is wisdom literature? Essentially, it's just instructions for successful living. Wisdom literature is instructions for successful living. We reflect on the reality of the human existence. So broadly speaking, we see two types of literature, of wisdom literature in the Bible. Two types of wisdom literature. The first is proverbial. So hence the book of Proverbs, right? Proverbial wisdom. These are short sayings, right, that are easy to remember, and they state the rules for personal happiness and welfare. I think one really helpful thing to remember about proverbial wisdom is that they are generally true. So it states a truth that it may not always play out exactly like that, but generally that is a wise rule for successful living. It doesn't mean it's going to play out exactly like that every single time, but generally this is a good thing to live by. It's proverbial. A good example of this is Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1. I'll read that to you. And you guys, as I call these out, if you want to write them down, and you can look at them yourselves too. Proverbs 15:1. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Generally, that's true. Now, you could give a gentle answer to someone and they could fly off the handle still, right? It doesn't always happen that way, but generally we understand this is a good rule to live by. A gentle answer turns away wrath. So that's proverbial. The second is speculative wisdom. So these are monologues or dialogues. So we see the book of Ecclesiastes as a monologue, right? It's this wise man reflecting on his life and giving real life examples. We see Job is a book of dialogues where they attempt to delve into such problems as the meaning of existence and the relationship between man and God. These are all examples of speculative wisdom, Ecclesiastes and Job specifically. Well, the starting point for understanding Old Testament wisdom literature is the book of Proverbs. So what that means is if we're going to understand all of Old Testament wisdom literature, we need to have a grasp on the book of Proverbs. Proverbs concerns morality. It teaches us how to live properly in this life. And the foundation of living rightly in life is, do you guys know, what does the book of Proverbs say? The beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. That is the foundation for living rightly. That's the starting point for all wisdom is reverence for God. And so as we're reading all wisdom literature, we have to have that as our starting point. That if we miss that it begins with reverence for God, we're going to miss the rest of it. It gives us a lot of instruction, but again, it's based on that, having reverence and respect and worship of God. Now, then you take the book of Proverbs and you consider the other wisdom literature, right? So you got things like Ecclesiastes and Job, right? So you can think about like a rocket ship. You have Proverbs, which is the main compartment, and then you have Ecclesiastes and Job, which act as the boosters, the rockets that propel the rocket, right? So they all work together, but they are what propel the main rocket ship. So Ecclesiastes then, what it does is it tests the wisdom of Proverbs through skepticism. It reflects on real life problems, and it applies the truths that we see in the book of Proverbs. A man reflects on living wisely. So you have King Solomon, and he's thinking back on his life from all perspectives. He describes grief and sadness. He observes these things, and he comes to the end, and he admits that anything lived in this life apart from God is vanity. It's vanity. It's purposeless. So Ecclesiastes is testing Proverbs. Job, on the other hand, is testing wisdom through suffering. So Job, he lives out suffering. It's his lived experience, and he grasps the problems from within, from the perspective of the sufferer. So he lives out these wisdom claims through suffering. Now, what is poetic literature, right? So that was wisdom. What is poetic literature? Much of the Old Testament is poetic in spirit and structure. There's a lot of poetry-type literature in the Old Testament. And poetry, it uses powerful imagery to convey ideas. So things carry more weight when it's written poetically, right? So the main features of poetic literature. I'm going to give some examples here, and again, you guys can write these down and even turn to them if you have enough time. But the Hebrew language was an ideal instrument for expressing poetic speech. Annalyn, you already referred to some of this, the way that it's written in the Hebrew language. It was written very poetically with, some of it, each line beginning with the letter of the Hebrew alphabet and so on. But it was written in a very poetic way. So the first thing we see is the idea of figures and metaphors and hyperboles. These things are extremely common in poetic literature. So for instance, over in Psalm 91, we don't have time to read the whole psalm, but you guys can write this one down, and as you read through it, you'll notice, you can pick up on these things. Psalm 91 is full of examples of figures and metaphors, images that capture ideas. So for instance, we see here, I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. For it is he who delivers you from the snare of the trapper and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you may seek refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and a bulwark. It's full of figures and metaphors to describe the faithfulness and the strength and the goodness of God for his people. It helps us put almost like a mental image to the characteristics of God. Another feature of poetic literature is we see the normal unit of Hebrew verse is the couplet. A couplet of two or more parallel lines. So in Psalm chapter 27, verse 1, this is a verse that many of you probably know. It says, the Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life, of whom shall I be afraid? You can see that couplet, those two verses that convey the same idea, but they strengthen one another. And so we read verses like this, and it's clear that there's a point trying to be made here by repetition. On the other hand, Hebrew poetry is also rhythmical. This is one of its distinguishing features. Rhythm in Hebrew poetry, though, is a little different, right? So I'm going to explain the best that I can here. Hebrew parallelism, rhythmic. I'm trying to think if this is in your notes. I don't think these are. No, these are not. So you want to write these down underneath the poetry section. When we talk about parallelism, there's three basic types here. All right. So the first one is synonymous parallelism, and these are big words, but I promise these are going to make great sense here in just a second. Synonymous parallelism. The thought expressed in the first part of the verse is repeated in the second part of the verse in different but equivalent terms. All right, so here's the example you can write down. Psalm 19, verse 1. This is synonymous parallelism. Psalm 19, verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Those two lines are synonymous with one another. They're conveying the same idea. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies above proclaim his handiwork. It's repeated in the second part. The second is antithetic parallelism. Antithetic. ANTITHETIC T-I-C. Antithetic parallelism. Right, so this is where the thought in the first part is contrasted with the opposite in the second part. All right, so here's the example, Proverbs 13:9. Proverbs 13:9. All right, so the thought in the first part is this: the light of the righteous rejoices. And the opposite, but the lamp of the wicked will be put out. So that's conveying an idea, right? That the light of the righteous rejoices, but the lamp of the wicked will be put out. That's proclaiming two truths that are related to one another. It's conveying an idea, right? That the way of God is right, and it leads to joy, it's light, as opposed to darkness, which will be put out. All right, the third example is synthetic parallelism. Synthetic. What this means is the idea that's expressed in the first line is then developed and completed in the following lines. So like a truth is stated, and then it's teased out more. It's completed in the lines that follow it. So it'll proclaim a truth and then tease it out further. So here's the example, Psalm 3, 5, and 6. Psalm 3, 5, and 6. It says, I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. So we see this idea that the Lord takes care of his people. That we go to bed at night and we wake up again in the morning because God sustained us through the night. And therefore, what do we have to be afraid of? If the Lord is the one who sustains our life, then why should we fear man, even though we have enemies and they're setting themselves against us and they're surrounding us? We don't have anything to fear because it's ultimately the Lord who sustains life, not them. So it's a truth and then it's teased out even further. That's synthetic parallelism. All right, now, I guess the question, or one question we might ask about this is why poetry, right? If you're like me, poetry can be very confusing. So you may wonder, like, why? Why did God give us these truths in poetic form? Well, poetry conveys a greater meaning. And even though it may be difficult, if we wrestle through it and really work with it, again, it conveys a greater meaning. It helps us understand it in a greater light, a more clear light even. It helps us to tease it out further. So here's an example, all right? Here's a truth. Jesus Christ, who never sinned, died for sinners to pay the penalty they deserved. Would you guys agree that's a true statement, right? It's full of truth. But now listen to Isaiah 53:5. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and by his wounds we are healed. Same truth, but man, doesn't that just pack a punch? Like, doesn't that descriptive language just make you think about all that Christ did for us? The pain and the penalty that he bore on the cross for us, which we're reflecting on this Holy Week. You can say the truth, like Jesus died for me, but when you think about it in the way that Isaiah wrote about it, it conveys this greater picture of what Jesus did. It conveys feeling. It's something tangible, right? We can grab hold of. We can grab hold of those emotions that we feel, those feelings that we have, and it helps us to remember it. So the book of Psalms, like the whole book of Psalms is a great example of this. You read through the book of Psalms and you realize Christians are not supposed to be emotionless people. Like, we're saved and we're fine now. We have no emotion. Like, the psalmists wrestle with stuff. They wrestle with realities and suffering. They wrestle with the thought that, has God abandoned me? How long will God turn away from me, right? How long must I endure these things? Like, they wrestle through these emotions that we have as humans. And so we can read the book of Psalms and we can be given the freedom to wrestle with the things that we're struggling with. And also at the same time, we're pointed to this great and glorious God who sustains the life of his people. So we have both of those. And Psalms allows us to have that greater feeling in life, to wrestle through these things. So that's poetry and wisdom. All right, now the next few that you can see there on your handout, we're going to look at the Gospels and epistles and apocalyptic literature. And we're going to go pretty quickly through the Gospel and Acts and the epistles so that we can spend the rest of the evening on prophecy and apocalyptic. And I think you'll see why. It's a little easier to understand the former rather than the latter. So quickly, let's look at the Gospels and the book of Acts. So we're gonna couple Acts with the Gospels here, right, for this lesson. All four Gospels and Acts, they together provide a comprehensive understanding of Jesus, of his life, and his ministry. So the Gospels and the book of Acts, they help us understand Jesus, the way he lived, the ministry that he carried out, the work that he did, who he was. But at the same time, each book can stand on its own in the sense that they're each written to a specific people by a certain author, and they kind of each have their own slant to them. They each have their own audience and purpose for writing the same message, which is the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. All right, so let's just consider a few things about the Gospels and Acts. First is the genre. What is the genre? What would you call the genre of the Gospels and Acts? Because the Gospel and Acts are slightly different genres, right? But they're kind of the same. So first, with the Gospels, they're what we call bios. It's the idea of an ancient biography focused on key events in a person's life and teaching. That's what the Gospels are. They are biographies in a sense. Acts, on the other hand, or I guess the other side of the coin there, is legitimization. Acts, it defends and brings legitimacy to the early church, which was birthed from the ministry of Jesus. So it traces the development of the church after Jesus ascended into heaven. Now the chronology of them. Chronology. This is important. While the Gospels are historical accounts, they are not always arranged chronologically. Right? So you could be reading and see that, this gospel writer has this event here, but this one has it here. That's because they're not always written in chronological order. They have reasons. All right? So with this type of genre, bios that were written in that time, they were written to emphasize topical ideas rather than being in perfect chronological order. So each writer is highlighting certain things. So if we come at the Gospels like a 21st century biography or autobiography, we may be a little confused because they're not written in perfect chronological order. I think you get that now. Next is harmony. While each of the Gospels offer varying points of view, they all make the same point. So there's differences, but they all make the same point, that Jesus is the promised Messiah who died for our sins. That's the main point that they're each communicating overall. So that's the Gospels. Now Acts. The book of Acts picks up where the Gospels left off. We see Jesus died and then rose from the grave, and then he ascends into heaven, and then the church of Jesus Christ is birthed from all of this, and that's what Acts records for us. It basically shows us how this group of ragtag disciples becomes the Christian church. It tells us about it. Acts is the story of the gospel penetrating the Roman Empire and growing by the grace of God through the bold witness of the followers of Jesus Christ by the power of the Holy Spirit. That's what the book of Acts is showing us. All right, so that's the Gospels and Acts. Next is epistles. Epistles deal with established churches and their issues. Epistle is just another word for a letter. So they are letters written to specific churches about their specific issues. Right? Those are epistles. So understanding how to study these letters is significant, right? Since they constitute the bulk of the New Testament. Right? We have 21 letters out of 27 books in the New Testament. I'd say that means that they're pretty important if it's the bulk of the New Testament. So we have to understand them. Epistles are generally structured into 3 parts. These are on your notes. We have 3 parts. We have an opening, which is the greeting, kind of gives a little bit of context. And then we have a body of the letter, and then we have a closing of the letter. So as we're studying epistles, these are some things to keep in mind. Studying the epistles. Remember that they were all written after Jesus died and rose again and descended into heaven. Sets them apart from all the other books of the entire Bible. They're the only books written after Jesus died, rose, and ascended into heaven. So how do we interpret them? How do we interpret the epistles? Well, for the most part, interpretation is pretty straightforward since they were written from the same side of Jesus' earthly life as we live in today, right? So that's helpful. But the one challenge that we may face, and I've alluded to this already in this class, is that we have to consider context. We may not always be privy to all of the context for each letter. So for instance, the book of 1 Corinthians seems to have been written by Paul in response to a letter that he received from the Corinthians. Evidently, it's alluded to in the letter that they wrote him concerning some issues, and so he writes them back, and that's what we have here. Well, we don't have the letter that the Corinthians wrote to Paul. So we don't know everything that was discussed. And so we have to interpret, and we kind of have to put some pieces together. It's almost like we're constructing a conversation, but we only have one side of it. So we have to piece together the other parts sometimes. So that could be an issue. We have to remember that. But some understanding of context is always helpful with the letter. To remember who's the author, who's the audience, what was the major issues that Paul was addressing, or James or Peter, and just remembering that it was written to real people in a real time and space. At the same time, these letters speak with amazing relevancy to our context today. It's amazing. It's almost like God intended it to be that way, right? That it was written so long ago to specific people, but it still applies to us. And I'm being sarcastic here. That's obviously the way that God meant it. That it still applies to us today, even though it was written to a specific context back then. It's living and it's active today. Those are the letters. Next, we have prophetic and apocalyptic literature. This is where it could get confusing, right? So let's just hang together here for the next few moments. When people think of prophecy, they tend to think of foretelling the future. And that could be kind of true with prophecy, right? Or apocalyptic literature, but really prophecy is more forthtelling than it is foretelling. So it's not always telling the future. It's just being very straightforward with God's people. Prophets, they spoke truth to God's people. They told them the reality of what they were living in or facing or what they were looking to. So it was more forthtelling rather than just foretelling of their future. Prophets function to shine a light on Israel's disobedience, and they highlight how their sins are against God's law. And in some cases, they tell how their sins were predicted by previous prophecies. In other words, the prophets were prosecutors of God's covenant. So they were applying it to God's people and reminding them of it. And we have to remember that all prophecy is based on the book of Deuteronomy. I remember when I first read this, or when I first learned about this, it was so helpful because if you look in the book of Deuteronomy, you see, obviously God's law is given, but what we also see is we see the blessings that are promised for obedience to God's commands, and then we see curses that are promised for disobedience to God's commands. In the book of Deuteronomy, we see the blessings and the judgments, the consequences. And so if we remember that, then we see that the prophets, they're really just applying that truth that's laid out to God's people in Deuteronomy. That, hey, you were promised these blessings for obedience. You were promised these judgments and consequences for disobedience. So they're applying the book of Deuteronomy. But now there is an element of foretelling the future, right? They look forward to and they promise one of salvation or judgment. So they do point God's people to a future of judgment or salvation. But it's not like looking into a crystal ball and telling someone their future, right? That's not what it means when it's talking about prophecy. Now, admittedly, prophecy can be difficult to read. I don't know about you, but every year when I'm reading through the Bible and I get to things like Daniel and Revelation, those are really apocalyptic more than prophecy, I guess. But you look at Isaiah and Jeremiah and all the minor prophets, and some of the wording can be difficult to read, difficult to grasp. And also the predictions can be difficult because they have multiple levels of fulfillment. So if we're looking at a prophecy that's given, right? You look at the book of Isaiah where it's prophesied that a virgin is going to give birth. Well, that partially comes true with Isaiah's fiance having a child in Isaiah chapter 7. But we know ultimately it's fulfilled by Mary giving birth to Christ. So that's just kind of one example of how prophecy can be confusing sometimes. So one author says that when you look at prophecies are like a mountain range, right? You can think that it just looks like, you think there's just one range, but as you get closer, you realize, there's other ranges behind it too, all right? So think of prophecy like that. Now, in your handout, on the back page, there are 8 tips for interpreting Old Testament prophecy, and I'm not going to go through those right now because we still have to get to apocalyptic, but you guys have that. So I'd encourage you again, just kind of read over that, again, digest it on your own, but there's some helpful tips there to consider when you're reading Old Testament prophecy. All right, now lastly, we have interpreting apocalyptic literature. So I already alluded to it. Daniel certainly has portions of apocalyptic literature, but Revelation is obviously the most famous and the most applicable example of this type of genre, the book of Revelation. Revelation is probably subject to more commentary and speculation and interpretation than any other book in the Bible. It can be confusing. In fact, John Calvin, he never wrote a commentary on the book of Revelation. You think, wow, he didn't even do it. Like, what hope do we have, right? But it's just because it can be confusing, right? In this book, we have everything from angels to a lake of fire to dragons. I mean, it's full of everything you can imagine, right? So it can be difficult to read and interpret today. So what are we to make of these things? I think a lot of people read Revelation as the book where God just unleashes all of his wrath and fury on mankind, and because there's a lake of burning fire and sulfur, and there's dragons and everything, right? There's a beast, and we can think of it as just only a book about God's wrath. And so we can become confused by that or put it off and not choose to read it, but that would be a mistake, right? Because we know that all of Scripture is profitable. It's all good and useful for teaching us. So even that includes the book of Revelation. That just because it's difficult doesn't negate that truth, that it is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training, right? All right, so when we think about Revelation, a lot of times we limit it to being a book that is only about matters of debate, about the end times, right? It's a book about the millennium and when Jesus is coming back and What role does ethnic Israel have in all of this? That's what Revelation is about, and we limit it to those things. Matters of debate, right? So for instance, right now, like even on the news, like there's talks of the vaccine that I assume all of y'all have gotten by now is the mark of the beast, right? And I mean, again, there's nothing new under the sun. Like people have been doing this since it was written, that they're always looking for the mark of the beast and so on. Like, just so you know, I don't think the vaccine is the mark of the beast, okay? And that's not the point of the book of Revelation, right? That's not what it's meant for. Revelation has greater themes. And in fact, Revelation is meant to encourage believers. It's meant to, if you're a Christian, the book of Revelation is meant to encourage you. Right, here are 3 tips for understanding Revelation. 3 tips. First, understand the background. What is the background of the book of Revelation? Well, John wrote it, right? John wrote it after he had a vision from the Lord. So he's writing down his vision from God. And when he has this vision and he writes down Revelation, the gospel has already been preached throughout the entire Asian province. So there are tons of followers of Christ at this point, all throughout the Roman Empire. Right? So remember that the gospel has been preached in their time to the ends of the earth, it seemed. So there's a lot of Christians. They all recall what Jesus promised right before he ascended, that he would return and establish his kingdom, right? Jesus said those things, that he would come back. Well, the church has been looking and longing for that ever since he said it. And these Christians were facing persecution and suffering at the time. And so they're wondering, has God forgotten about us? Is Jesus really going to come back? Because we're facing enormous persecution right now for following him. And so then you have John's revelation of the new heavens and the new earth, and what's going to happen when Jesus returns, when he establishes his kingdom. That's meant to encourage these believers facing persecution, that God is going to carry out his plans of salvation. So to a group where it seemed like nothing was happening, this was good news. If you're asking, does God really care about me? Can he really do anything about suffering or persecution? Is he going to do anything about it? If he can do anything about it, Revelation is a really encouraging letter to get. If you're asking questions like that, because he is. He's going to redeem his people and set everything right. So if we're trying to understand suffering and God's sovereignty, Revelation's a great book to look at if you're trying to understand those concepts. You don't need to fear it or mystify it. It's meant to encourage. That's the first. So second is understand the genre. So understand the background, but then understand the genre. There are at least 3 genres within Revelation. And it helps if we remember that we have first apocalyptic, second we have prophetic, and third we have epistle or letter. If we remember that also helps us interpret what's going on. So apocalyptic is basically unveiling. Apocalypse is Greek for unveil. So contrary to popular belief, Revelation was not written to confuse people. It was written to unveil God's plan, to make it clear, to make God's plan for judgment and salvation clear to those who read it, not to make it murky and confusing. It's written to unveil God's plan. Also, apocalyptic literature functions as prophetic, as I said. So it does speak of what will happen in the future. But it uses emphasis on highly symbolic language to do so. So it is telling us about Christ returning and establishing his kingdom and what all will happen, but he uses symbolic language to convey these truths. So we need to be careful to read this book according to its genre, not interpret the symbolic parts too literally, right? This Revelation is not history. A lot of people pick up Revelation, and I've even been guilty of this at times. You pick up the book of Revelation and you read it like it's tomorrow's newspaper. And you think, oh, this is what I'm going to get tomorrow. This is what everyone else is going to get tomorrow. I've got all the keys here. I can understand and interpret what the days ahead look like. Exactly, with all the headlines. But if you do that, then you can run the risk of applying some things that God never intended from it. All right, so we got to understand the background, understand the genre, and understand the purpose. This is where that third genre comes in, the epistle, the letter portion. Understand the purpose. Revelation is an epistle. It was written to specific congregations. All right, we see this in Revelation chapter 1, at the very beginning there. Revelation chapter 1, verse 10 and 11. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day when I heard behind me a loud voice like the sound of a trumpet, saying, write in a book what you see and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus and to Smyrna, to Pergamum, to Thyatira, to Sardis, to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea. So this was written to 7 real churches at the time. So it's not an abstract treatment of the end times, but a practical book for local churches facing persecution. It's a message that we should understand our present trials, not in light of this earth, but in light of heaven. That's the message of it. So as we look at what we're facing presently right now in our lives, we should interpret our lives through heaven, not through earth. So what is to come? What is God's plan? And if we keep these things in mind, it helps us to be careful readers of Revelation and the whole Bible, but of Revelation specifically.